The following teaching is possible thanks to the friends and partners of Spirit and Truth Fellowship International.
As I've traveled and taught on the open view of God, the power model, that God doesn't have exhaustive foreknowledge of what's happening in the future, one of the questions I've gotten back is about Psalm 139, and I didn't originally teach on 139, but I think it's an important psalm to cover and something that's very important to understand when it comes to the open view of God. Now, as we look at Psalm 139, the way it's translated in some versions, it makes it seem like God knows everything about me for the future. I mean, here's the ESV. And the problem verse that we're dealing with is verse 16. So this is verse 16 out of the ESV, the English Standard Version. He says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." Well, that certainly makes it sound like God knows the future if he's writing about every single one of my days before any of them came to pass. But I'm going to contend that this is not the way that Psalm 139 verse 16 should be translated. We're going to be looking at a number of different versions that translate verse 16 differently than that. But let's see if we can get a handle on the whole psalm first of all. Kind of understand where God's coming from. Because the psalm is about how wonderful God is. And so it starts out in verse 1, "You've searched me and known me." Verse 2, "You know when I rise up and when I sit down." Verse 4, when a word's just on my tongue, even before that, like we would know today in brain chemistry, when the word's kind of tinkling around on your brain yet, it hasn't been spoken, you know what I'm going to say. In verse 6, then he says, "But this knowledge, this is too wonderful for me." I mean, that you know all this stuff, that you've searched me and you know me. He says, "Where could I go from your spirit? I can't hide from you. You know everything." Then in verse 13, he says, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." By the way, we really are. The human body is fantastic. And if you haven't taken the time to study it, boy, especially if you can find some doctors and some medical men and women who really understand the body and are Christian and have looked at it from a Christian creation perspective, oh, the body is just absolutely amazing. So here's this great psalm that says, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made," which is really true. "Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well." And we should. We should know very well how powerful God is, how wonderful God is, how much he loves us, how much he's done for us. In verse 15, he says, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth." So in the depths of the earth here actually refers to the womb. It's actually a metaphor. It's not that God makes us in the mud. He makes us in the womb. But that's how it's referred here metaphorically. And then, of course, verse 16, which is our problem verse. Then verse 17, "How precious to me are your thoughts." And so now we get to verse 19. And so after talking about how wonderful God is for 18 verses and how powerful he is, how much he knows, then the psalmist says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked." And I love this because it's just so human. Isn't this the way you and I mean, like for example, if I want to get somebody to do something and I think that maybe they're not really inclined to do it, then you start out with, let's say I want them to write something for our magazine, The Sower. So I started, "Well, you're really a good writer." And you just kind of talk to them like, "You're really a good writer. You express things so well." And you talk to them about all the great ways that they are. And then you come out with, "By the way, I'd like you to write something." And here's the psalmist, God, you're so great. You know me. You search me. You're so powerful. You knew me in the womb. You know what I'm going to say right when it's on my tongue. You're just as powerful. So, will you please kill the wicked? To me, this is just really, it's just so human and it's so powerful, and it's just the way we tend to relate to God, that we butter him up and then we ask him to do something for us. And then he tells why. The wicked speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain, blah-de-blah-de-blah. So, and then verse 23, he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And then the psalm ends with the last verse, and see if there be any grievous ways in me. Well, now just by the closing of the psalm, we should know that the psalmist doesn't think that God knows everything about what the psalmist is going to think and do. Because he ends up in the end of the psalm by saying, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. So the psalmist can't be saying that if he actually believed that God knew everything he was going to think into perpetuity, and then see if there's any grievous way in me. So what we get from the psalm then is a message that, God, you're great, and I want you to do this for me about killing the wicked. And this comes out of a pure heart, and if you'll search me and if you'll look at my thoughts, you'll see that these thoughts aren't vengeful, they aren't evil, they're just true. Now, but again, the problem versus verse 16, in your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me. Now, as we've seen, this translation supports that God has foreknowledge. But there's other ways of translating and understanding this psalm. First of all, as we've seen, if we simply read the whole psalm from start to finish, by the end of the psalm we can see that the psalmist did not think that God knew all of his thoughts into perpetuity. Another thing we need to be aware of is that this is Hebrew poetry. And as Hebrew poetry, it's written in many ways in a way that's kind of unclear. It can be interpreted one or two different ways. So how do we determine when something can't be just read like prose, but it has to be interpreted, can be interpreted this way or that way? How do we determine? From the context and the scope. And from the context and from the scope of Scripture, we can see that really what we're dealing with here is God. The psalmist is talking about how wonderful God is, not how much God knows him and his thoughts into perpetuity. Even things like where in the ESV it said, you have formed, let's see how I'd say, the days that were formed for me. The word formed in Hebrew is yatsar, and one of the translations of that can be planned. So God plans things for us. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to happen. So are there other ways of interpreting or understanding this? Well, absolutely there are. Many other versions of the Bible don't translate it the way the ESV or the NIV or the NET does at all. For example, even the King James Version, instead of referring to God knowing our days, it's that God knows about our parts as they're being formed over days. The King James, your eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. In Rotherham's Emphasized Bible, he says, mine unfinished substance thine eyes beheld, and in thy book all the parts of them were written, the days they should be fashioned, while yet there was not one among them. In other words, you're looking at the bones being formed in the womb, bones that aren't even there yet, for example, or parts that aren't even there yet, but you planned for them, and through the days they're going to come to pass. The New English Bible says, you did see my limbs unformed in the womb, and in thy book they are all recorded. Day by day they were fashioned. So again, the psalmist is talking about the power of God, the knowledge of God, and how he's just, even when there's nothing there, there's no bones there, there's no organs there, God plans for them and plans them out and makes them happen. The Tanakh, which is the Jewish Bible, a Jewish translation of the Bible, translates this verse, "Your eyes saw my unformed limbs. They were all recorded in your book. In due time they were formed." The very last one of them. So, sure, God is planning for the things to come together in the womb. That's a great way to understand this verse in the context of the whole psalm and in the entire scope of Scripture. And I'd also like to point out that even if the verse was translated in a way that God planned the days of our lives, if we've watched the other segments of my teaching on the open view, then you know there's many things that God plans for that don't come to happen. For example, God sends Isaiah to Hezekiah and says, put your house in order, you're going to die and not live. Then Hezekiah prays and prays and prays, and what's God do? He says, okay, I'll let him live a little while longer. So even the plans of God get shifted and changed as you and I live life and appeal before God. But really, I think that the King James Version, Rotherham, the New English Bible, the Tanakh, and some other versions have the right handle on this verse in its context. That it's not talking about God planning our days before they were formed. It's God taking the time and planning for us as we are formed in the womb. And then that fits the context of the previous verse, verse 15, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intimately woven. Your eyes saw my unformed substance." And then God planned for our parts, and we come out like this, and then God has a purpose for our life.